Okay, here we go with part 8, and I'm not sure about you, but I like to keep my viewport as uncluttered as possible when I'm working. I've had these splines visible for a long time. I'm going to just double click on the little traffic lights to hide those so we can't see them in the editor view. I've also got this fall off here visible, and this is from the shader soccer ball, I believe. So let's just uncheck the visible checkbox for that object. The other thing is we can see all our lights. Now, if we have our display set to a Gouraud shading, then that means we'll see the effect of the lights as we move them around with shading and speculars and things like that. So very often you'll want it to be like that. So we don't want to just select the layer that these are on, kind of hide them in the editor or hide them from view. We could do that, and you can see that we get a difference in our shading. This is the same thing as if we selected them and kind of hid them in the editor view like this. In fact, if you wanted to select all your lights, there is quite an easy way to do that. It's, might as well show you this at this point. It's an object, or a tool should I say. It's called the select tool. If you come up here to this little menu with the question mark, the top item here is select tool, and we have all these options here. But if you just click select tool, you then have the option to select certain types of objects. So you can just click light, and you can see that that's selected all my lights for me. Pretty useful. You can also come into tags, uncheck restrict to active objects, and we can say let's select all our compositing tags, or let's select all our texture tags. You can see that it selects them all just like that. So it's quite a quick way to select all of a certain type of object or tag. So if we select all our lights, for instance, like this, we could come to the attributes, basic tab, and say visible in editor off, and that then hides all our lights. But you can see at the same time we've got the same problem. We've actually hidden the result from our lights as well. So if I just undo that to reselect and then undo so that they're now visible in editor on the default setting. The other way we can do it is we can come up to this filter menu and we can uncheck certain things in here. As you can see, I've got grid unchecked and I've got the horizon unchecked. At the moment you can't really see the grid because the camera is down on that same level, but we can uncheck something like lights in here. We still get the result from the lights, we just can't actually see them in the editor view. So it does make for a much cleaner looking view for when you're working. And if we had all these things visible, then we would have a really cluttered view. I'm also going to come in here and just hide my lights cameras from the manager view because we don't need to see them in our object manager either. Cool stuff. Okay, so you can see we've just got a much cleaner editor view for working now, and I much prefer that. Okay, so there is a bit of a gotcha there as well because we've filtered out these certain objects, well, lights in this example. When we add a new light to the scene, although we can see it now, we can only see the axes. If I deselect it, it's disappeared again. So it becomes difficult to kind of manipulate certain objects if you add them to the scene and they're filtered out. If you press Shift V, which is your kind of viewport settings, you can come to the filter menu here, and this is the same as this list here. So you can switch them on and off in here as well. And as you can see, lights are switched off, but I can switch that on and then all my lights will become visible again. If we jump to the end here, you can see that they're all visible. So that's Shift V, and this is all your kind of viewport settings. So there's quite a few things in here as well. One of the things you may be wondering is why some of the parameters are kind of written in a normal type, whereas others are written in bold type. Now the reason for that is because they are preferences, and it's kind of whether or not that's a local or a global preference. And what I mean by that is when it's bold, it means that it will be like that on every scene that you open, but when it is normal, it will only be specific to the scene that you're working on. You can actually right click and you can say make a parameter global or make parameter local. Is just hidden out of the capture view. So you can change these. Let's just pull this up. So if we select here, we could say make parameter local. And if we click on here, we can say make parameter global. So that is why they are displayed in bold and normal. And your filter, as you can see, all these settings are global. So what that means is if we switch lights off here, and if I create a new scene and add in a light, if I deselect the light, you can't see it because it's actually being filtered out. So if we come back and switch that back on. So that is a bit of a gotcha, but we don't need to worry. We're going to remember that we've done that. So I'm just going to switch off lights for now, and if I forget later, someone remind me, will you? Okay, back to the job at hand, and in this part of the tutorial what we're going to do is we're going to actually use the MoGraph Tracer object to trace the position of some elements, and you can use the MoGraph Tracer to trace object axes or object vertices, things like that, and we're going to use it with the matrix object to trace the matrices that it generates. And what happens with the MoGraph Tracer object is that it traces these elements that we choose, and it then generates a spline from them, and we can then use that spline for other things such as attaching objects to or sweeping, etc, etc. So what we're going to do, as I say, is we're going to trace the MoGraph matrix object. So let's add that into the scene. Now the matrix object is similar to the cloner object in a lot of its settings, but it only generates matrices. It has the option to also generate thinking particles, but we're not going to go into that at the moment. But what you can do with the matrix object is you can then clone onto the matrices that it creates. So you might think, why would I want to do that? And although this isn't part of this tutorial, it's worth understanding the difference. Now the difference is, one example would be, for instance, if you create a cloner object and you have a cube that is being cloned using this object, say you've got it set for a grid array, and then you add it into a hierarchy with a null and a bend deformer. So this then bends the cloner and the cubes. What will happen is the cubes themselves that are being cloned would also be deformed. So if you wanted to create this kind of bent, deformed shape with your grid array, but you didn't want the cloned objects to be deformed, what you can then do is you can deform the matrix object, and that will then only deform the matrices. So all those positions, etc., will be moved with the deformer. You can then use a normal cloner object, clone onto the matrix object, and all your cubes will stay undeformed. So that's just one example of why you might use it. So essentially it is just creating matrices, and that's what we're going to use to trace. So let's switch to our timeline so we can see our keys, and what I'd like to do is, at this kind of point in time, as our words whiz round and our sphere is rotating, I thought it would look pretty cool if we had lots of streaky lines that also whiz round at that point in time. So I'm going to use the matrix object, and I'm actually going to set it to radial. And what radial does, if we just increase the radius here, you can now see, I'm not sure if you can see it, but we've got some little grey cubes. If we increase the count, it should become more visible. There we go. You can see that we have a radial array of all these small cubes, and these cubes represent a matrix each. If we were then to use the cloner object, let's just show you. So if we add a cloner object into the scene and say add a cube as a child, let's make that cube a little bit smaller, so around there. If we set the cloner object to object mode, we can drag our matrix in as the object, and we have now cloned onto all those matrices, you see. So this is just showing you what I was talking about before. And there we go, just looking at it from the edit to camera point of view. And you can see that if we adjust our matrix objects, so let's reduce the count, then that also reduces the number of cubes. And you can also note here that our light include exclude lists are working because the cloner object is not being included in any lighting, so if we rendered this it would just come out black. However, you can see it there in the reflection. Okay, coming back to our matrix object, we're not actually going to clone anything onto it. What we want to do is we want to actually trace the position of these matrices. So before we do that, let's just set this up. I'd like it to only be half of this circle and probably not so many. So rather than me keep nattering on, let's come down and have a look at our settings. I'm going to set the radius to be 450 so that it's a little bit bigger than our sphere. Let's actually switch back to our scene camera. Okay, I don't want 36 either. I think something around maybe 7 will do. And then the next thing we can do is we can adjust the start and the end angle. So if I adjust this, you can see that instead of it being the full 360 degrees diameter, it's actually only between these two values. So I'm going to set the start angle to be 240, and I'm going to set the end angle to be 310. So now it's only travelling from here round to here. If we just press R so we can rotate this, we can bring it into view. There we go, you can see it a little bit more clearly. So this is the part that I'm actually going to trace. I think that they should move in the same direction that the sphere is rotating. So let's take our matrix object and let's add it as a child to the null sphere. And if we come to the coordinates tab, let's just reset the heading, pitch and bank. Okay, and now if I rotate it round, you can see that its heading is moving on the same axes as the sphere. And this is the path that I'd like to trace. So it's just a matter now of coming into the timeline, setting up our keyframes for heading, and then assigning this object to our tracer object. Now our animation here starts on 10 and goes for 10 frames to frame 20. So I think we should start our tracer slightly before. So let's just come back a few frames to say frame 7. If we switch to the F2 for our top view, and let's just sort of zoom in so we can see what's going on. From the top view we can scrub the heading of our matrix object and we can see whereabouts they're positioned. So actually I'm going to set this to -90 and let's add a key here. And if we now move to frame 20, this is where our text is fully visible, and I think that the matrix thing should go all the way around the object. So again I'm going to go kind of 3 more frames past, and now we can scrub this value all the way around to around here, and that will be 270. Okay, so now we have our matrix object, and at that point it whizzes around. That looks like pretty good timing. So it's just kind of as the text comes on, slightly ahead of it maybe. Let's switch to our camera view. Okay, so now we've got that set up. Let's add in our tracer object and have a look at a few of the settings on there, and then we can go back and carry on animating the matrix for the next piece of text. So with the matrix object selected, choose MoGraph Tracer. Whichever object you have selected will be added to the tracer include list. Select the tracer, and we call this tracer globe lines. Okay, and in the attributes manager for the tracer we have our basic and coordinates tab as before, and we also have an object tab, and in here we have a few more settings. And in here the first thing you will see is the trace link, and this is our matrix object that has been dragged into here. So if you wanted to trace any other objects, you can literally drag them in, or you can click and delete your object from that list. So we've added that in, so let's just press play. Okay, and you can see we've immediately got a result coming from our tracer. If we just switch the tracer off, you can see that it switches our splines on and off. And that's exactly what's happening. It's actually creating splines from the motion. Now it's moving quite fast, so you can see that we're getting a kind of linear spline with quite a lot of steps in it. Now the reason for that is because if we look in our tracer object, let's just skip down a little bit, we have here the type of spline that it creates, and you can see that that's set to linear. So very often that will be okay, but because this is moving quite fast from frame to frame, we might want to set it to a different type. What we can do is we can click in here and we can choose from all the other spline types that we see on a normal spline object, and for this I'm going to select B-spline, and at the moment intermediate points is set to none. So let's select intermediate points and choose this as natural, and the number is 8 by default, and you can see that already our splines are much smoother. We have a much smoother result. So if we render this, we won't actually see the result from our tracer object, so we need to do something else so that the splines are used. We could use something like Sketch and Toon and have splines as an option in there, so we could draw lines using that. What we're going to do here is we're going to actually create some geometry, and we're going to use the sweep object. So with the tracer selected, hold the Alt key down and add the sweep NURB. Let's call this sweep globe lines, complete with typos, glober. Okay, so what we're saying at the moment is sweep something along these lines. So we need to put a spline in between here so we know what shape that we want to sweep along there. So with it selected, the sweep object that is, press the shift key and let's add in the circle spline. Now by pressing shift, what that does is that adds the object as a child to the previously selected object. So the circle spline here is obviously a little bit large, and where we have our light include and exclude, they're being excluded currently. I think that we need to set this circle down to much smaller, so I'm going to put in something like 2.5. There you go, and now you can see we have a result. If we render now, we should just get some black objects there, which is because they're not lit. One thing that we do need to be aware of, however, is that the circle spline is set to adaptive with an angle of 5 by default. If we, let's just increase this amount to say 50, and let's select the sweep object. Okay, so you can see that the number of polygons that we've created is absolutely vast, and this is going to cause a problem and slow down our scene. Okay, that isn't too much of a problem, but we will need to make sure that we fix that before we carry on. So if we just select our circle spline and let's set the intimate points to be, say, natural. We could adjust the angle here, but I'm just going to set this to be natural and set the number to be 2. Now you can see here that this has made it much lower res, and if we select the sweep, you can see the number of polygons has reduced massively. However, the fact that it is quite jagged and we can see the edge of our polygons doesn't really matter, because when we set this down to be a radius of 2.5, they're going to be so small that that's not going to be noticeable, and we've managed to keep the polygon count down by hundreds and hundreds of polygons. So again, we're just optimizing the scene to make sure that we get the best possible playback as we produce our animations. So cool stuff. So at the moment we've generated these splines and we've used the sweep on them, but they're just sitting there. Okay, as we come through, they draw on. I'm dragging it there, so they're kind of coming through the object. But if we just go back to the beginning, let's just press play, and we should see a reasonably good result. There we go. But at the moment, the splines are just staying there. So the tracer object has drawn the splines. Once it's drawn them, they then exist in the scene, and they're there for the rest of the timeline. So how can we resolve that? Well, one of the things we can do is we can say to the tracer object to limit the spline. And we have a limit from start and we have a limit from end. And what we want to choose on here is limit from end, and then we can specify the number of frames that it limits to. So let's limit it to say 10 frames. So what that means is as it draws the spline, once it gets 10 frames long, it will then stop drawing it from the end. The easiest way to understand that is just to watch. So if we press play, you can see our splines get drawn on, and after 10 frames they stop drawing. So you essentially create a kind of worm snake effect. Cool stuff. So talking of worms and snakes, at the moment the size of our spline is the same along the, oh, I meant to press stop there. Okay, so the size of our sweep is the same all the way along. This is due to our circle radius. If we select our sweep, we have in here the option to adjust the end scale. So let's set the end scale to 0, and you can see now that this is scaled down, and at this end it's much smaller. I'd actually like them to be thin at the other end and fatter at this end, so that the actual radius of the circle or the sweep tails off towards the end of the kind of trail that we've created. So what we can do is we can just reverse the sequence of the spline. And if you remember from our circle spline, we have the option to reverse it in here. Well, lucky for us, the tracer object also has that option, and if we look at the bottom here, it says reverse sequence. So if we check that reverse sequence, you can see the result there in the editor straight away. The sweep object now is much smaller at this end. So as they travel around, they kind of peter off. Cool. So that's looking good. Let's move to our next point in time where the top stories whizzes round, which is frame 55, and if we press F 3 times we can jump back 3 frames. And if we select our matrix object, which is the object we're tracing, come to the coordinates tab, let's add a key for 270. Let's come through to the next key, which is 65, and then go 3 frames after. Okay, and now we can drag our matrix object all the way around again. Okay, 630. Let's add a key here. Now I do think we need to just come in and check the F-curve for this, because all the time the matrix object is behind the sphere, it is static, it won't be tracing any splines, but if we have any movement on our F-curve, it may sort of move backwards and forwards and we'll get a kind of small spline being generated. We can scrub through and you can see that that's actually what's happening. So if we press play from the top view, you can see it whiz around and create the initial shape, and then it sort of meanders backwards and forwards, and then it whizzes around again. To be perfectly honest, it probably doesn't matter in this scene because the camera's not actually going to see those trace objects, but let's just adjust that now anyway, and we can easily do that. We can just select those 2 middle keys, choose keys, and just choose 0 angle, and that just makes them flat. So now they're just static. You can see they're not moving at that point in time. And then it whizzes around again, boom, boom, boom. You can see that as I scrub, I'm jumping too fast and the spline doesn't get drawn correctly, so you often have to just press play to see the correct result of the tracer object. Otherwise it can be a little bit misleading. Okay, cool stuff. So yeah, we're getting a pretty reasonably good result with that. I'm liking the way it's looking. And we need to either light this or add some materials to it pretty soon. So we've got one more set of kind of streaks to make. Again, let's jump to the next set of keys where the camera, or where the globe spins around, sorry. And let's move back 3 frames, come to our matrix object, add a key for our heading. Let's jump to 113, switch to the top view. We can just do the maths and add 360 onto it if you like. Okay, 990. There we go. I'm gonna have to come back in and just adjust my curves again. There we go. At this point in time, we're not going to really need to use our matrix object anymore. We don't want it to trace anymore. So we can either disable the matrix object here, or we could disable our tracer. You don't actually need to disable any of that if you don't want. The only reason I suggest that is in case you are working on a scene where perhaps you may have them, for instance, these are a child of the null. If we did any animation and move that later, then it would all get traced again. At this point in time, if we let's just jump back to here and press play. Okay, so we should see our matrix whiz round and the lines trace on any moment. There we go. I'm just going to stop there, and as you can see, this is the point of the last key of the matrix rotation, but the traced splines are still there. So let's just press play. Okay, and we can see at this point that it should be 10 frames past that key, and the splines have all disappeared now. So that's a good point where we can actually enable or disable our matrix object. So let's uncheck the enabled checkbox and add a key. Go to the beginning, let's enable it because we want it enabled for the beginning of the scene up until that point. And now, as we animate through, we can see our streaky lines animate on. Okay, and they will do again. Let's switch to our camera view so we can see it from there. Finally, they animate round there. Okay, cool stuff. So at this point in time, it'd be nice, as this wipes on, we have the specular highlight that travels across. It'd be good if we also perhaps had a couple of streaky lines in a similar vein to these that travel around the globe. We could have some that travel across the news today, maybe just to give it a couple of lines above and below. This time, instead of tracing the matrix object, we're just going to actually trace the position of some nulls. So first of all, I'm going to add in a null here. Let's call this trace null top. Let's change the R there. And if we just take this up to somewhere around here and control drag, actually going to make this one a child. It's called trace null middle, and we can drag this one down somewhere around there. Let's drag another one. Let's call this bottom one bottom, and let's just set this to -600, say. I think it should perhaps be a little bit lower than that. I'm going to select this one and let's raise this up slightly to -560, and let's set this to -620. So if we drag the top trace null out, we can see our nulls at the bottom here. Let's just deselect and have a look at the spacing. Okay. I think we could just take this down slightly, maybe 285. 280. Okay, that looks a little bit better. And let's grab our bottom null and let's just pull that back, not too far, about 100 units, something like that. Okay, so then we have one kind of trace leading the other one. So now what we can do is we can animate the top trace null. We can just animate it whizzing across here like this, and we can then use that as the source for our tracer. So the first thing we need to do then is to animate the top null. So let's set our X key. I'm not sure actually, somewhere like 0. That's perhaps a little bit too far over, so let's just drag it. Let's start them just at the edge of that globe, which looks to be around 200, so let's add a key for X there. Is that the right point in time, do you think? I think it should have been earlier. Okay, so we could have always moved the position of the key, but let's just set this up. And I think that it would be nice that as the text kind of wipes on, we have the tracer happening at the same time. So let's come back to, say, around 110. Okay, a few frames before, 107, just as the first letter is starting to appear. And let's add a key for X there with a value of 200. If we then scrub through, and let's just move to the point where all our letters are on. Okay, so if we just go a couple of frames after that, because what I want to do is drag the null so it comes right off the edge of the viewable area. And don't forget that bottom null, which is slightly offset, so let's just take it to around there and add a key. Now if we drag through, you can see that null whizzes across as the news today wipes on. So we just need to set that up to be traced. Cool stuff. So let's just take our sweep that we already have set up and just control drag to duplicate that, and let's just double click and call this text lines. Use the arrow keys and we can move down and just rename the tracer text lines. With the tracer selected, switch to the object tab and let's delete the matrix object out of the link. And what we need to do now is drag these null objects into this link so we can select them all and then our tracer disappears. So what we probably want to do is just lock that tracer and then we can select our nulls, drag them into that list. If we unfold it here, we can see that they're all in there. We can now unlock the attribute manager. If we deselect, and let's just press play, and you can see that we have some traced lines appearing. It did look a bit sporadic then, I'm not sure why. Let's just come back a few frames before so that the splines disappear. Okay, so let's just step through one by one. I think what that may be is possibly because the circle is a little bit small and they're quite a long way away, so I think it may just be the editor redraw. Because they're black, we can't render that at the moment, so the best way to check this will be to create a material and add it to these objects, or to enable them as part of the lighting setup. So I'm going to create a couple of materials quickly, and then we'll come back and check on these and see if they're okay or if there is a problem there. Let's switch to the material manager. I'm going to select my cylinder first of all and come into this Fresnel that we set up earlier. I can right click and copy this gradient. Okay, now I've done that, I'm just going to double click to create a new material, and let's call this orange gradient. And for this I'm actually going to use the luminance channel, and the luminance channel doesn't require any lighting, so no matter where our lights are, this will look fully luminant. And in the luminance channel I'm going to click on the texture tab. Let's just drag this up a little bit first, and I'm going to choose gradient. Now with the gradient we have the option to set the type, and we have 2D and 3D gradients. We also have the actual gradient here, so the first thing I can do is to paste the gradient that I copied from the Fresnel. So we now know that we have very similar colours that we're going to use on our sweep glowy lines. The next thing that we need to do is just make sure that the orientation of the gradient is correct, and we have what's called UVW with materials, and you can think of that like XYZ, but it is for the mapping of materials. Most materials just use UVs. It's only 3D materials that use the actual W coordinate as well. And with a sweep we have the U and the V, and the V actually corresponds to the length of the sweep. So if we switch this to V on our gradient and we drag this onto our sweep globe lines, and we can then control drag it onto the text lines. If we come back slightly and let's just press play, now render, and you can see that we can actually see our lines, although they are looking pretty thin, and it was, by the looks of it, a redraw issue because they didn't seem to be very clear there. But now we've rendered it, we can see that we do seem to be having the correct trail. I think it's possibly a good idea to just come into the sweep text lines, select our circle, and let's set that to 5 radius. Okay, and immediately looks clearer. That looks better already. So let's just rewind to a point here. You can see that as I jump back, the nulls are jumping back to their original position, and it's causing a spline to be drawn by the tracer. So this is what I was saying before, very often you have to rewind to the beginning and press play, but if we press play from here, that will be enough time for our splines to disappear and us to get a correct redraw across. Okay, so there we go. What I may do in fact is have this middle line and make this slightly thicker again. So let's call this text lines, and let's control drag this, and let's call this text middle lines, tracer text middle lines, and in this tracer let's delete the bottom null and the top null, and in the other tracer let's delete the middle null. And if we select the circle for our middle and change the radius of that to 8, okay, and let's press play. In fact we can jump to around here, and this should redraw it, and we should have a thicker line in the middle now. There we go, and you can see that that line in the middle is slightly brighter, so we've got a little bit more weight on that. This is quite a small editor view. If this was rendered kind of full size, it's going to be a lot more clearer. And once we've got a little bit of anti-aliasing going on, that should be nice and smooth. Okay, so before we end this part of the tutorial, just a couple of things that I'm going to add in. At the moment we have the football texture still visible there, so I'd like to wipe that off and this to become more of a sort of generic icon for a news program. First of all, let's come up here and reset our layout back to the MotionWorks layout that we use for this project. Okay, cool stuff. I have all these objects here, and I'm going to just come to my layer browser and let's add the sky to scene elements first of all, and then let's select these new items and using control drag them onto MoGraph generic. If we now select our cloner object that's creating the football texture, I'm going to add in another plane effector. This plane effector I'm going to call plane effector cylinder scale down, and I'm just going to drag this down to the bottom of my object manager. If we select our cloner and just have a look in the effectors tab, you can see that this cylinder scale down has now been added. So we can fold that back up, select the cylinder scale down, plane effector, deselect position, let's set scale uniform -1, and you can see that the football texture disappears. I'd like to use fall off for this, so I can wipe it across, and let's give it something like 250 for the Z. If we come to the coordinates tab, we can now adjust the pitch to 90, and now even from here as we pull it through, you can see our football texture is being wiped off. So let's just switch to say our front view, zoom right in, and let's come to the timeline. So at this point in time, this is where we are back with the camera, so we can see news today. So we need the football texture to be wiped off by that point. I think we need the football texture to be wiped off around here. So let's grab our effector and just drag it up. 670. Add a key for Y. Let's jump back to the point before it zooms back, and we can then drag our effector and we can just take it all the way down. I think we're going to see this more clearly in our front view, somewhere around here. -680, and add a key here, and now as we pull back you can see that wipes our text off. We're getting some kind of sporadic tracing going on there, but don't worry about that. When it all plays in a linear fashion forward, it will all be correct. Cool stuff. So I can switch to the fall off and just make that invisible. So that's wiped off the soccer texture. One of the other things that I wanted to add into this was to make it a little bit more interesting with the reflections. Was quite simple, just to take the sky object that we have as our reflection map and just add some keys for the heading. So at the very beginning set it to 0, and then at the end let's say set it to -360, just so it does one rotation. And what that will mean is the environment map will turn really slowly, and this should give us some nice kind of highlights, and the reflection will move very slowly across all our reflecting objects. If we just right click on here, we can choose animation, show F curve, and then in here select all, and let's choose key linear, just so that if we select our sky object, you can see that it now just rotates throughout the whole of our comp. And that'll just add a little tiny bit more interest to the whole scene. Okay, so I'm just going to come back and switch this to automatic mode, and then show animated. I'm also going to say switch off show vector track. And that just hides where it shows the position, rotation, the kind of group heading for that track. Cool stuff. At this point, I think it's a good idea to save. And we're ready to move on to the next part of the tutorial. So we've come a long way since the very beginning, and our scene is pretty much nearly ready to output. I think that we'll spend another part of the tutorial adding in some more graphic elements. So there's a few more things that I'd like to show you with using cloners. So what we're going to do in the next part is we're going to look at using the cloner in radial mode, and then we're going to use the blend mode to blend between the different parameters of some parametric objects. And once we've done that, we're going to actually clone the cloners, and we're going to modify the clones that are visible with effectors. So this should be quite a fun class, and once we've completed that, we should be almost ready to set up for render output, and then we'll be moving over to After Effects. But we've got a couple more tutorials in Cinema 4D before we get there, so let's move on and start adding in our last set of graphic elements.